Welcome everybody to our special session on evaluation and impact investing. I am so thrilled to welcome our all-star lineup of Veronica Olazabal and Jane Reisman and John Sherman. Veronica is Chief Impact and Evaluation Officer at BHP Foundation and also the President of the American Evaluation Association. Jane is founder of ORS Impact and John is founder of PFC Social Impact, and the three of them together have probably spent more time thinking about potentially productive interactions between the worlds of evaluation and impact investing than anybody else that I can think of. So we're very, very happy to have them here. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to them to carry it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mike, for inviting us as well. We are pretty excited about being here with you all today. And as Mike said, John and Veronica and I are very active in the American Evaluation Association. In fact, Veronica is our current president, but she founded a SIMTIG, which is a special interest group about impact measurement in the Evaluation Association, which has been growing robustly so that we can figure out the bridge building. And that is what we're really about today with this run-up show of who we're here, who we are, what we are doing, and why we are here. We'd also like very much to do a bit of evaluation myth busting, because we've learned over time that people think evaluation is many different things, and we'd like to talk a little bit about what it is and what it's not. Then we would like to share some powerful tips. We thought to ourselves, given this series, what are some of the tips that we would really like to offer you as next steps that would integrate evaluation into your measurement and management practice? And then we want to hear from you, what you're curious about. So that's our run of show, and I hope that I hope you find it interesting. We'd love for it to be interactive, and we'll get it started. So why we are here. I will start us off and each of us will share, but we are here because we believe there's great synergy, that in fact, there's been a strong social science base to evaluation that contributes a lot to the impact measurement and management field, but we don't usually call it evaluation. And at the same time, evaluators have a lot to learn about the finance field and impact investing field in general. So that we need to be able to modify our practices in order to be more relevant as well. So the purpose of today's session is to actually show the synergies between these two fields and to demonstrate how it could be easily integrated into your work. So spoiler alert, but we really do believe that evaluation methods and tools, there's tools and there's methods and there's even mindsets, have a tremendous value for testing assumptions about your investments and portfolios, about the high impact that is intended to be made. And without evaluation, an investor cannot be held accountable for or make the appropriate adjustments in a balanced portfolio. So that's our belief system here. And I'm going to turn it over to Veronica about where did we come from?
Let me just rewind a little bit to 2008, when the term impact investing was coined at a famous Bellagio conference funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And I was there at the time, just learning, like many people, about how people were using their capital for good, and that capital could be used for good. And so I then left the Rockefeller Foundation. And so fast forward to 2016, I came back. It was about 10 years later, and I came back as leading our measurement practice, the Rockefeller Foundation measurement practice. And I kept getting these questions from the field, which was, hey, so you guys must know something about the state of impact and impact investing. Where are you? And so I then went on this journey along with my colleague here, Jane Reisman, to go answer the question. And we did a couple of things that Jane will speak about in terms of the side-by-side comparison to get us to a bit of a conclusion around the state of evaluation, impact measurement at the time. But I will just share that in 2016, the uncovering was there was a lot of fragmentation, there was a lot of tools, there was no consensus, and sadly, we were going down a path of impact washing, right? Talking about impact, but not actually having any of the substance underneath it to be able to say anything significant about how impact investing was achieving the promise of really changing the nature of the way we were using our capital. And those two pieces are published in these side-by-side reports that you see here, and can be downloaded quite easily and are open to the public. But Jane, why don't you share with everyone what we actually then did?
Let me just make a couple of comments about what we really did in these reports. Is that we really discovered that in many ways, the field of impact measurement has grown up alongside the field of evaluation, and there has not been a huge amount of convergence, and it's quite unfortunate, but part of it is because of the different purposes of why they've existed. And evaluation grew up in the 50s trying to measure and figure out how to be successful with grand experiments of social change. And in fact, impact measurement grew up more in the 70s when we had the environmental crises starting to show up in front of us, and lots of writing about how we need to be more, we need to have more compliance with parts of the environmental development that would cause positive impact or negative impact. So really, the environmental movement is what really spurred on impact measurement so that we could avoid negative impacts and we could actually have measurements and accountability about that. We know that has evolved quite a bit since the 70s, but that in fact, these two origins have made them very, very different. And the evaluation movement also has many different parts to it. And whereas it started with an experimental design, it has really grown in many ways. And the focus of evaluation now is primarily impact management, but we call it other things. We call it strategic learning, and we call it utilization-focused evaluation. But evaluation has evolved to be relevant for timely decisions, but the origins of it really came out of large experimental designs. So we think that's an important distinction, because as long as these are seen as very separate streams, we can't grow them together and use the best from both. We think there's been much progress in that. And the second piece here, the piece about situating the next generation for impact management, talks about the evolution in impact management from developing simple metrics, which was very important in the early days, or what are some of the metrics, to performance measurement, to studying or deeper studies about outcomes to really understand how outcomes change. And the fourth level is systems analysis, understanding the ecosystems in which impact happens. And that's in the situating the next generation. And we feel that the evolution of these four kinds of evaluation practices are mirroring what we see in the impact measurement field. And we'd like to suggest that all of them have a purpose, but as you want to go deeper into impact, that the outcome studies and the systems analysis, which we'll talk more about, are quite relevant. So let me just move quickly to some common myths people have about evaluation to set the stage about what we want to share our tips. We want to bust these myths for you. So the first myth is that evaluation is only needed to establish causality. And in this complex world with many actors all working towards similar global goals, any one action is a contribution toward that end goal. And we would like to say that evaluation is the business of establishing data and evidence that support claims about contribution, and that it's occasionally a causal activity. And there are times when it's really necessary, but that the primary amount of evaluation that happens is really about, can you establish evidence that you are supporting your claim about contribution to impact? So I'm going to move to the next myth, turn it over to Veronica, evaluation myth 2.
Jane, so evaluation myth number 2 is evaluation is one size fits all. And typically in conversations with various different types of investors, whether you're an impact investor or an asset manager in a development finance institute, or an asset owner or philanthropy or even corporate, which is where I am now, there's this stereotype that really, really holds us back from using evaluation to increase our impact potential. Evaluation is about experimental design, and experimental design is a randomized control trial where you're trying to control the world like you would in the public health space, like with vaccines, in order to be able to show the attribution of your one investment. It really came out of big public epidemiology type of spaces, but it then moved to government. But when you're thinking about government is 93% of all the investment going into doing good, because that's their job, right? And they need this really high bar. They have 20 to 30 years to invest in a particular space, and they're typically working at scale. So they have essential control over many of their investments in terms of people. Every other investor is not working at that scale. And because we're not being able to, trying to artificially create a scenario where context doesn't matter, where you have control of all of the variables, particularly in communities where we work, which are probably the most dynamic communities because of you've got poor, you've got vulnerable people, you've got storms, you've got climate, you've got lots of dynamism. It's very difficult to actually apply that type of evaluation into that frame, but very often that is what I hear when I join a conversation around, oh, we really can't do evaluation because we can't do X, which is the academic randomized control style. You can maybe do that. It could be right size. It could be fit for purpose for you, but more and more, generally, that is not the evaluation approaches of today and in the future. And the other myth is, well, you have to wait until the end. And I know that John will talk a little bit about that, but relatedly, that just means that, you do a midterm and a final evaluation. And so what we'd like to exert and share through this conversation is that actually there are many different forms of evaluation. And there's a whole tree. There's a lot of debate. Everything ranging from how do we use evaluation for adaptive management, which we'll talk about today, to evidence synthesis around like, what do we know about the state of things in order to be able to actually say something about the choices that we're making as an investor. To evaluating people's actual lived experience. For example, in the private sector, we often think about using customer feedback to actually develop our products and services, and then to continue to iterate upon that. Very similarly, in the impact sector, we should be reaching out into the field and testing our products via our strategies or our initiatives via our investments with people that are actually experiencing the types of changes that we would like to see. So myth number 2, evaluation is not one size fits all. Second, the other reason and rationale for why I often am in the room and hear, well, we can't afford to do evaluation, which is actually connected to myth 2. And spoiler alert, evaluation can cost many levels. And government, as I mentioned earlier, we're usually looking at scale. So we're looking at a huge amount of data that we need. Maybe we're looking even at big data these days and machine learning. I mean, that might actually be expensive too, because the regular investor doesn't have access to all of the secondary data sets that are out there in the world. However, it can be really affordable. And I worked and tested with, and I know that there's someone from the Acumen team there with the formerly Lean Data, now 60 Decibels team, to really be able to shrink down the cost of collecting data, because that's what evaluation is. If you have a really good question, you want some data. How do you test it so that you're not actually self-reporting and just validating your own biases, but rather asking others to come in and help you do that within your own market or within your own ecosystem? And they have done a really good job of taking what often, and I can say because I have many data points, can be something like $400,000 to $800,000 to ask that one question, to like something like $5,000 to $20,000. And so depending on where you are, that may seem like a lot and they may seem like a little, but relatively speaking, the sheer magnitude of cost, it shouldn't be a reason for why you're not engaging in evaluation, because it can be affordable. So over to you, John.
Wonderful. Thanks, Veronica. Just one point. I am the co-founder of PFC. With that, I want to talk about myth 4 before we move into some of the basics you ought to think about with evaluation. And myth 4, Veronica has already mentioned this a bit, but just again, the idea that evaluation and what we call evaluative thinking, this mindset about how you put together how you're going to figure out whether or not you're having impact or not, that begins not at the end. It begins at the beginning. When you're first thinking about what the problem is that you're trying to solve with your investments, through your due diligence process, through the active investment, through the iterations of how you adapt to what's happening in the environment, which we'll talk more about, and of course, when you close it out. So evaluation, this kind of thinking is a thread throughout. It's another important tool that you have in your toolbox that is as relevant and as important as any other part of how you're thinking about your investments. So says the evaluator. You know, those myths talk about how you should not be thinking about evaluation. Here are some 7 basics that we like to think about how you should be thinking about evaluation. While there are 8 here, there are only 7 because you can see one is said twice because we think it's really important. But the first one is evaluation is not value neutral, that we are not scientists in a lab. Evaluation, it's really looking at who's going to benefit and how are they going to benefit or be impacted negatively by what your investment is doing. Jane mentioned about outcomes versus outputs. Outcomes matter. As you know, just counting the number of people you employed or the number of solar ovens that you sold or what we call the bean counting world is important, critically important. However, it's the so what, how did that lead to impacts that you want? As we already talked about evaluative thinking, number 3, it's integrated throughout the process. It's just bring this idea it's part of your overall management system, and think of it that way and not as again, being at the end only. I talked about measurement is not the end in itself. Really, this links back to the 3rd point is that measurement informs management. And so what you do with what you're learning is an important part of what we consider a good evaluation. 3rd, as Veronica mentioned, evaluation is a systemic way of thinking about, you know, what you want to solve and how do you make sense of going about doing that. And we have, again, there's a series of methods. Many of you are familiar with those, whether qualitative in nature or quantitative in nature or somewhere in between, that evaluators bring to the table to help you think through your impacts. We'll talk a lot more about this, the 6th one here of systems mindset. And that is accounting for and thinking about the bigger systems in which you're working. And tip 1, we'll dig into that more. And finally, you know, the idea, again, about having innovative methods. Evaluation can be right side for what you need. And it can be iterative, whether it's real time or close to real-time feedback to be able to give you the kind of information you need to adapt your investment and adapt to what's happening in the social, political, economic environment in which your investment is working. So 7 key basics that you should pay attention to. So we're going to talk about 3 different tips here. And quite frankly, these tips they interrelate. So they're not standalones. They overlap quite a bit. And so the first one is that, as you can see from this map here, is that you're not alone. You are, your investment is occurring, as we've said it several times already, in a broader environment, in a social environment, in a political environment, in an economic environment that means that whatever you're trying to do is usually going to have, you know, whoever's sitting in the middle of the impact you're wanting, affected by lots of other things, and is going to make decisions on lots of other reasons and behaviors based on many other things. So this is the idea is that you're not alone, you're not going to solve the problem yourself. And that this example, this is some work we did in India working with the climate funder, that their intention was to both want to help the Indian government create the right kinds of policies and with the supporting technologies to reduce the overall carbon footprint and to advance, of course, good climate resilience practices. You know, they had a very limited idea of how that was going to work until we started mapping and showing that there are lots of nonprofits in one color here. There are lots of technology folks in another color here. There are lots of foundations also playing in this space here. There are lots of other multilateral agencies playing in this space? How are you understanding your role and contribution when all this else is happening? And these communities are thinking a lot about everything else besides climate. They're thinking about, how do I educate my kids? How do I make sure I have enough electricity so I can have the lights on at night? That means I might have to have coal versus something else. And you're telling me you're going to take away my coal. So these are real issues that you run into and that need to be addressed. Okay, so how do you start thinking about it differently? And what do you really need to know about systems? In a way, we've set this up, right? One, you know that they're dynamic. Whether you look at your family or you look at your community, they're dynamic, they're complex, they're always changing. And we know that social problems, environmental problems often arise from some dysfunction, some failure at the systems level. There is this lack of understanding and this idea that there's some direct cause effect in these interventions, which we know is not true. They're messy, systems are messy. Talked about no simple cause effect. Jane talked about contribution versus attribution. This is really important, again, to understand that whatever you're doing is happening because there's a lot of other things happening too. And you need to understand which of those things that are happening have strong enough signals that are affecting what you're doing and could be affected by what you're doing. And of course, there's a lot of noise. So it's just, you have to figure that out. And we'll talk about that next. Whatever you do today may not work tomorrow. So you need to have, it's temporary, you have to be adaptive. There's a lot of moving pieces out there. Localize. What works in one community is not going to work in another because their local systems are different. And of course, if you're working in different countries, then you have all the political systems. And finally, systems require boundaries. You can't figure it, you can't do it all. So how you start figuring out, putting your arms around what the systems look like, which are important parts of that system and which aren't. In order for us to get a handle on the system, to start bounding it, we brought in the Human Security Framework. It's a UN framework that at least allowed us to say, so what are the major kind of what they call the major security issues that most people worry about? And so we started mapping that about into the agricultural issue that on which we were working, evaluating, to understand who are all the other kind of key players and how do they affect, in this case, it's a common name in one part of Ghana, Lemisi. How does it affect her and all the different things that she's doing and wanting to feel secure about? So one way to start thinking about boundaries is find a system, some structure to help you think about it. It could be the Human Security Frame. It could be the SDGs. It could be something else, but it's there. And the systems piece is one way to help think about bounding it. So here, we've already really talked about what do we mean by systems. And in a sense, we've already talked about why you should care about those systems. Parts of those systems are going to affect the quality and the level of impact your investment's going to have, and vice versa, that you're going to be affecting them. So to begin to understand how to put your arms around this system, not only finding a framework that would work for you, but also, and quite frankly, much more importantly, is you have to start listening to the community. You have to start asking them. This gets back to the fact that evaluation doesn't have neutral values. Your intention of a lot of impact investment is to affect individuals or communities that are particularly impacted by something, suffering from something, having a problem, challenge. So in order to find out whether or not they see the solutions you're bringing to them, and whether you're on the front end or during it, you have to listen. You have to put your ego aside, forget that you know everything, and ask them about what their experiences are and what is important to them. And to do that iteratively throughout, again, this is like evaluation begins at the beginning. You have to do it throughout the investment process. We often find it really helpful to start mapping this, as we've showed in some of these previous slides. Mostly to find out, and you don't have to do it like as rigorously as we did on the first one. We did that for a very intentional reason. But the idea is to understand, and Jane used this term yesterday, and Jane, I've adopted again, is that idea like, what are strong signals and what's just noise? So talking to the community, you find out from them what their strong signals are, what's important to them. And then you can use as ongoing feedback. And we know that the kinds of 60 decibel work that they're asking, they're talking to this community, especially customers, around just that, something very iteratively. So that's kind of big picture systems. There's two pieces of it that we're going to talk about now in the next steps. With that, Jane, I turn it to you.
Okay, thank you, John. So that was tip one, that evaluation is really embedded in systems thinking, and that obviously is very relevant to impact investing for all the reasons we've been sharing, and I know that you've all been figuring out and you're experimenting with your impact rating systems. So now I'm going to move to a topic that Mike told us he introduced, and it's one of the topics that very, very near and dear to evaluators, which is theory of change. So Siri, get me to my destination happens through a theory of change. I am such a fan of theory of change and have been since I discovered it in the early 00s. And what I love about theory of change is that it is a tool that makes all of the assumptions extremely clear to all of the partners who are working on a strategy. And it does that because the process of creating a theory of change creates alignment between the folks who are part of the theory of change, whether they're the investors, whether they're the implementers, whether they're the beneficiaries on the ground. The alignment between the ideas of what needs to happen to create change gets ironed out in the process of creating a theory of change. So it also creates the directions about your assertions about what causes what to happen. So when you do a theory of change, you often say, if we do this, then we expect that happens. You're making very explicit those linkages between what you're investing in and what change you expect to see. And why that becomes really important is that currently I'm involved in evaluating a large guarantee pool investment fund. And some members of the fund are very happy if they get to stop one, which is more wealth in communities. It's a deliberate guarantee program to try to increase wealth in underserved communities, especially BIPOC communities or women-led or BIPOC-led businesses. Many of the partners would be very happy if there is more wealth flow, but other partners wouldn't be happy unless they actually change the systems about underwriting, that the ideas and assumptions about credit and risk need to be revised in their minds. And they believe that this pool can get to that level of system change. So there isn't complete alignment, but the theory of change shows both. And for some, they're satisfied if they get to step one. But if we don't get to step one, we'll never get to step two. So the testing of the linkages is what's very important about theory of change. I'm going to share an example shortly, actually Veronica will share it, about accountability ceiling. This is one of the best news of the day, is that you're not accountable for the whole change, and every group needs to figure out what is their accountability ceiling, what part of the landscape are they playing in, and John showed us that there's a very, very, very complicated landscape when in reality, what is your accountability? The other thing is that you can communicate your position very clearly with the theory of change and really be very clear to all kinds of internal and external partners about where you fit in the ecosystem. And importantly, this goes back to evaluation isn't necessarily expensive. If you frame your evaluation questions clearly, it helps prioritize, what am I going to test? What is it that I need to test now in order to know that we are moving toward our theory? So this is a very different kind of methodology. So when we look at how long ago the experimental design was set up, which said that evaluation is about proving causation, that was the 1950s. Theory of change was set up in contrast to experimental design in the 2000s to say, we can test all of the assumptions and linkages along the way that are relevant to us. And that is practical and doable and timely. And that is what theory of change allows you to do, is you not only create the visual depiction of your theory, but you actually give yourself your testing of your logical linkages. Even the visual depiction helps people understand what you're doing. And that's another thing to know about the theory of change. Many theories of changes are written as paragraphs. If you can put it into a visual form, like a flow chart or something even more artistic than that, that is a very powerful tool to your partners who are either co-investors or who are implementers or who are stakeholders in the process. The other thing to know, we've already talked about it, it provides your sense of accountability. What do you want to hold yourself accountable to in that theory of change? It's a big landscape. Choose the part that you really want to hold accountable to. And your narrative about your assumptions is really important for adaptive management. If your assumptions don't happen as you plan, any program that was planned before 2019 has had a lot of their assumptions shaken by the pandemic and other events in the US, for instance, periods of racial reckoning, conflicts and wars in other places. We need to always be looking at our assumptions because our theories of change may need to adopt accordingly. So I'm going to turn this over to Veronica now, who's going to share an example and first situate when to use a theory of change.
Thank you so much, Jane. And so I, as an investor that sits across all of our work, so my title is Chief Impact and Evaluation Officer. And so really looking at these types of tools to be able to amplify how we get to our destination. So one of the questions that I often get is, when do I use a theory of change? Well, you can always use a theory of change. You can ask about questions around the industry. You can ask questions around if you're at a company level, you work or you have a portfolio of companies, you can ask at a company by company level, at a portfolio level. You can ask the theory of change around your customers or people and communities. And I would say that for where I am today, both at the Rockefeller Foundation, the BHP Foundation, but also when I worked at the MasterCard Foundation, there's an understanding that, if each of our investments has its theory of change, there's a question around, well, what does it all mean to who we are as an institute? What is our theory of how we're enabling that change? Because that does help get crisper and clarifying around everybody kind of rowing in the same direction. And so if you go to the next slide, here is an example. So this, I was talking to some of my board members the other day, and they're like, why do theories of changes all come in all shapes and sizes? Couldn't there just be one? Why are there always squares and circles and arrows? And so this is an example of a theory of change that we use at the Rockefeller Foundation to do exactly what Jane just said. And I'm just you don't need to know what this actual investment was all about. But what I want to show you is that this was an initiative that was aimed to generate, unlock some of the youth employment challenges in Africa. And so you're going to read it from the bottom up, and I'm just going to point you to some of the pieces that Jane mentioned. So for those of you in the evaluation space, we don't need to get into conversations around what's an output and what's an outcome, what's an intermediate. This is just a bit of a theory of the type of change that we would be expecting. And here, each one of these is actually our solutions. It's actually driven by a strategy where we're putting our dollars behind these various pillars. And so this is what we would be wanting to see over the intermediate term. Here in the outcomes area is what we would want these pieces to layer up to. And that's basically that young people are getting access to jobs, that employers are changing the way that they're hiring, and that government is changing policy, right? It's like very simple. And these three pieces together in our minds, when we were mapping out the space, are the acupuncture points. These are the points in the system that we think we have the most leverage, therefore we're going to begin investment there. And we assume that if we're to be successful, we would be generating this impact goal or impact thesis, which is that we would be seeing a systematic change that would be demonstrated by the value of an increasing support for this concept that we were trying to champion called impact sourcing in South Africa. And so that's a little bit of the qualitative type of systematic change that we would want to see. And then we would say, but we want to actually connect us to a concrete number. And so we did some modeling, impact modeling, and we put this 100,000 youth placed in jobs. So this was a 5-year initiative. If we did not see movement in young people being absorbed into the system, the adaptive management piece to us was we would stop making this investment, right? And we actually did do that. And we can talk about that some other time. And so this is the accountability line. So this is what we were holding ourselves accountable to, because on the left side here, you can see these are the points in the system that we thought we could actually control, and control, because, this is really complex stuff. And so then above the accountability line or the accountability ceiling, these are some of the changes that if unlocked, we'd hope to see in the longer term. but we were not going to be holding ourselves necessarily accountable to these because they were outside and above our accountability scope. Right? And so all of this you can read up on. It's on the Rockefeller Foundation website. We did a final evaluation of this initiative, and you can hear all about this stuff. But while we did a final evaluation, all of this that I just mentioned was happening during the whole investment cycle. It wasn't happening at the end where we were retrospectively looking back. If you move to the next slide, I'll hand it, and it's now back to me. So tip number 3, John mentioned this as a myth. We've been talking about it. Don't wait until the end. That is my tip for you. We talked about how the world is complex. But what we haven't talked a lot about is if you wait until the end, whether it's a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year initiative to actually start to evaluate something, you're actually running risks. In the corporate sector where I work now, and also in my independent philanthropy, we have way too many controls. And we have too many pieces around compliance that we're being held accountable for under the corporate, under our social value strategy. We cannot wait till the end to learn that we've been actually creating harm. That's not going to be good for our brand. That's not going to be good for our mission-driven story in terms of like some kind of scandal. And at the end of the day, if we're in the business of doing good, we should be actually asking and treating and be disciplined about these questions and this level of inquiry in the beginning, right? Because you want to make a profit, you start at the beginning. You want to generate good, you want to have good rate of return, start at the beginning. And so how do you do that from an evaluation perspective? So there is this, I'm going to call it an evaluation approach called developmental evaluation. And so you say, what is this developmental evaluation? So developmental evaluation is the evaluative approach that's been developed. It was designed by, and I'll talk a little bit about further, but it was designed by a man named Michael Patton because his experience as an evaluator, primarily with a lot of risk capital agencies like philanthropies, was that, we actually need some kind of disciplined way to be adapting, because otherwise you can adapt at any level for any reason that might be triggered by decisions that are evidence-based. So how do we do that in a structured way? And then typically it really involves bringing on an independent evaluator of some sort on your journey with you. And so if you move to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about what to know about developmental evaluation. And so I don't call it developmental evaluation anymore, although if I'm talking to evaluators, you all know what I mean when I say developmental evaluation. I call it our strategy for adaptively managing and course correcting. And so this strategy, so oftentimes as an investor, we're kind of early on. We're not in the business of having picking up investment opportunities that have been proven. Because if we were, why are we using our risk capital to actually change something? Right. And so we're usually in spaces of early investment, or we're in the spaces of testing new innovations, depending on our risk appetite, that could be, pretty aggressive or not. So developmental evaluation is a way to try to get some evidence generation in these very unproven, very dynamic spaces. It's the R&D arm, so to speak, of the evaluation industry. And it leverages many different things, including that we've been talking about, including customer feedback, theory of change, the fact that we're working in a system, and it, in terms of our hypotheses and assumptions, it's essentially, you can use it to test out those assumptions. And the only other thing that I'll say there, it helps you with quick, rapid iteration. And on the right side here, you can see a comparison between traditional evaluation and developmental evaluation that you can have in your packs and that we will not go through. But I wanted to show you, next slide, please, a point around the Rockefeller Foundation Zero Gap, our impact measurement and management methodology, which is actually a developmental evaluation strategy along the various investment phases. And some of the terminology that we've probably been using could be new to you, but some of the terminology that I'm about to use can probably is familiar. And Mike, as a champion of many of these concepts, has probably talked to you about this. So a couple of years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation became an asset management platform of sorts and started to pull capital emerged this portfolio called the Zero Gap Portfolio that was actually funded in partnership with the MacArthur Foundation through Joanna Cohen, who's actually on this and somewhere else now. And one of the questions that they asked us was, oh, it's great that you have this IMM methodology, but how does that align to the investment phases of your work? So we mapped this out, we created this map here so that we could, number one, if we start from the bottom, we can see, okay, what's happening within the investment life cycle. Number two, what's in the swim lane of the investment team and what's in the swim lane of the measurement team. So you can see that on the left axis. And if you look at the middle bucket, you can see our investment team while pipeline development is happening. They're also ensuring that their investee is aligned to our overarching sort of theory of change, so to speak, although we've never had a portfolio theory of change. This was project level or investment level. And while that's happening, we're determining the breadth and depth of the impact. We're thinking about theory of change. We're thinking about the magnitude of the market. We're thinking about how our investment is going to actually be able to move that system around a little bit. And then as we move into clarifying our impact strategy and framing, in terms of articulating some of those hypotheses, we then also start using some of the tools that you've probably learned about around the 5 dimensions. For example, taking our impact theory of change and pulling out of it, because if you've done the thinking, like what are the outcomes? Who are the people that are going to be most affected? What is our contribution, which to me is like the most important dimension. How much? I'm always asking, like, what are we doing? Are we accelerating? Are we catalyzing? Like, what are we doing? Like, how is that curve like shifting? And I know that Mike talks about the impact frontiers an awful lot. So really asking those types of questions then. And then we move forward with identifying some targets. And as we're doing that, the investment team is probably trying to determine the capacity. They might be doing some like ESG screening. Like they'll do as we move into underwriting, because that's what legal and compliance is asking for. And then we move into, okay, well, we need to put this into the reporting structures, because if we don't put them in, we have nothing to hold them accountable for. And we actually need that to both manage our upward accountability to our investors or our funders or our donors, and our downward accountability to our other investees and to the people and communities. And then, so you can see here the differences in the shading between the one green and the other green, then we close the deal. And that's typically what people say is impact measurement or impact management. However, that is your journey is just about the beginning. You press go, the investment flows, and then you actually start collecting that data that you've already preset yourself to collect, because otherwise it's just bespoke and self-reported. And you're making sense of it. You're actually then using the data to manage your impact. That's this like second to last green one. And then finally, maybe you decide to do an impact assurance. Maybe you decide to like assure your impact. Maybe you evaluate it. Maybe you assess it. This last bucket is typically what people think is the end, but actually you can see that everything that happened is evaluation. It's evaluative in nature.
Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks especially to our guest speakers, and have a good rest of your days.